The late summer sun baked the dust of Providence Gulch into a fine, pale powder that rose in lazy clouds with every footstep. It was a town built on hope and haste, its cabins of raw, unseasoned pine clustered in a shallow valley as if for warmth, though warmth was the one thing they had in abundance. For Abram, the heat was a liar. It whispered of endless days, of time to spare, but he felt the coming cold in the marrow of his bones, an inherited ache passed down from a grandfather who had learned the language of the mountains the hard way. He stood at the back of the assembly, his son Leo's small hand held firmly in his own. At 10, the boy was quiet like his father, his eyes holding a solemnity that did not belong to childhood. In the center of the dusty clearing, Elder Sterling stood on a crate, his voice booming with the certainty of a man who had never been truly tested by the land. "We build one great barn, one communal storehouse for all," he declared, sweeping a hand towards a stack of freshly cut timber. "Square and strong, with room for every family's livestock and grain. We raise it together, in a week." A monument to our unity, some murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered families. It was a sensible plan, a fast plan. But Abram saw the flaw. He saw it not in the wood or the nails, but in the shape of the land itself. He stepped forward, his voice low but clear, carrying in the still air. "The west wall will be too exposed, Mr. Sterling. The prevailing wind will drive the snow against it. It will build a drift as high as the roof. The weight will be too much." Sterling turned, his expression a mixture of impatience and disdain. "And what would you have us do, Abram? Build a round house like the savages your wife came from?" The cruel remark hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Abram's face remained impassive, though Leo felt his father's hand tighten. "No," Abram said, his voice even. "You angle the western face. Deflect the wind. Or build it into the lee of the ridge," Sterling scoffed. "We have no time for such foolishness. We build on the flat, and we build fast. You will contribute your labor and your timber like everyone else. It is the price of this community." Abram looked at the faces around him, hard, tired, and fearful of anything that might slow them down. He knew then that their minds were as square and unyielding as the barn they planned to build. "I cannot," he said softly. "I will not build something I know will fail." The elder's face purpled. "Then you will have no part of it. No part of the shelter, no part of the stores. If you will not stand with this town, you will stand outside of it. You have until sundown to be gone from the valley." The walk away from Providence Gulch was a silent one. Abram carried their 2 heavy packs, filled with tools, a cast iron pot, a few blankets, and the last of their dried rations. Leo carried a small canvas satchel, his gaze fixed on his father's boots as they left the last of the town's cabins behind them. No one came to say goodbye. They were a spectacle, a lesson in the price of dissent. Figures stood in doorways, their faces grim or pitying, but none moved to help, none spoke a word in their defense. The community had closed ranks, its decision absolute. They were ghosts now, erased from the life of the valley. They did not walk far, only a few miles into the rising foothills that bordered the valley to the north, a place the townsfolk avoided for its steep, rocky terrain and deep shadows. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, but Abram's attention was on the ground, on the subtle shifts in the rock formations. He was looking for something specific, a memory from a story his wife had told him, a place her people spoke of with reverence. "Here," he said finally, his voice rough. They stood before a great fissure in a sheer cliff face, partially obscured by ancient, gnarled pines. It was not a cave in the traditional sense, but a vast, shadowed moor that receded deep into the mountain. A palpable cold emanated from its depths, a stark contrast to the day's lingering heat. "This will be our home, Leo," Abram said, shrugging the packs from his weary shoulders. The boy peered into the darkness, his small frame trembling slightly. The air inside smelled of stone and ancient ice. "In there," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's cold." Abram knelt, placing his hands on his son's shoulders. He looked into the boy's wide, fearful eyes. "The cold is honest, son. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not. Out here, the wind is a liar and a thief. It will steal the warmth from your very bones. But in there, the mountain will keep the wind for us. We will build our own warmth inside its heart." He led Leo into the mouth of the cavern. The transition was immediate. The world outside, with its fading light and rising evening breeze, disappeared. Here, there was only a profound stillness and a deep, resonant silence. The floor was smooth stone, and as they moved deeper, the walls began to sparkle, revealing themselves to be solid, translucent ice, thick and blue in the gloom. They had found the ice cave. Work began the next morning. While the people of Providence Gulch raised the frame of their great, square barn with loud shouts and the rhythmic pounding of hammers, Abram's labor was a quieter, more solitary affair. He felled trees from the thick stands of pine on the lower slopes, limbing them and dragging them, one by one, to the mouth of the ice cave. It was grueling, repetitive work that stretched on for weeks. He was not building a conventional cabin. Instead, he was constructing a smaller, tightly fitted wooden box deep within the cavern, about 100 feet from the entrance. He used the techniques his grandfather had taught him, interlocking the logs with meticulous care, leaving no gaps for the cold to exploit. He built a low, angled roof, designed not to shed snow, but to hold in warmth. His only audience was Leo, who helped by gathering smaller branches for firewood and chinking the log walls with a mixture of moss and clay they found near a hidden spring. Occasionally, a hunter from the town would pass by. Garrett, the blacksmith, a man of practical skill but limited imagination, stopped one afternoon, his curiosity getting the better of him. He stood at the cavern entrance, watching Abram fit a log into place. "What devilry is this, Abram?" Garrett called out, his voice echoing strangely in the icy chamber. "Building a house inside a tomb." Abram didn't stop his work. He merely glanced over his shoulder. "I'm building a shelter, Garrett." "One the wind cannot touch," the blacksmith chuckled, shaking his head as he walked away. The story spread through Providence Gulch like wildfire, embellished with each telling. Abram had gone mad with grief. He was living in an ice hole like a beast. He was dooming his son to a frozen grave. The townsfolk used the tale as a cautionary one, a way to reinforce their own unity and the rightness of their path. Their barn was a testament to their collective strength, rising tall and proud against the sky. Abram's strange hovel, hidden away in the dark, was a symbol of madness and isolation. The light situational irony was lost on them. They mocked the very thing that was a pure expression of foresight, their laughter a hollow sound against the coming silence of winter. They saw a man digging his own grave, when in truth, he was building an ark. And as they hammered their last nail, Abram laid the last stone of his small, efficient hearth, a hearth that would soon burn with a warmth they couldn't possibly imagine. The first snows came not as a gentle blanket but as a sharp, crystalline warning carried on a northern wind. In the valley, the townsfolk cheered. Their grand barn was finished, its loft filled with hay, its stalls ready for the livestock. The communal storehouse stood beside it, its shelves groaning with preserves and sacks of flour. They felt secure, fortified, masters of their domain. A celebration was held, the warmth of whiskey and fellowship chasing away the encroaching chill. They had beaten the wilderness. They had proven Abram wrong. They toasted to their foresight, to their speed and unity, their voices loud and confident inside the solid walls of the meeting hall. Miles away, in the heart of the mountain, the first snow went almost unnoticed. Inside the ice cave, the world was unchanging. The wind that scoured the valley floor and rattled the window panes in Providence Gulch was just a distant whisper here, a rumor of a storm happening in another world. Abram and Leo sat before their small stone hearth, the fire casting a warm, flickering glow on the tightly fitted log walls of their inner cabin. The air was still and dry. The deep, abiding cold of the ice around them was not a threat, but an insulator, a massive wall of thermal stability that shielded them from the volatile weather outside. Leo, who had been so fearful at first, now understood. He could press his hand against the wooden wall of their room and feel a gentle warmth. If he stepped outside the wooden structure into the main cavern, the air was cold, but it was a dead, windless cold, nothing like the biting fury of the open air. His father had built a small pocket of summer inside a mountain of winter. Abram worked on mending a leather strap, his movements unhurried. He had done what he could. Their small larder was stocked with smoked fish, dried berries, and the meat from a single deer. It was not a bounty, but it would be enough. He had traded speed for certainty, community for conviction. He had listened not to the loud voices of men, but to the quiet wisdom of the mountain. While the town celebrated its perceived victory, Abram felt a quiet, somber readiness. He knew this was just the beginning. The first snow was a scout sent ahead of the main army. The real war was yet to come, and it would not be fought with confidence and whiskey, but with patience and a profound respect for the power of the cold. Winter tightened its grip. The playful snows of late autumn gave way to a relentless, soul-crushing cold. The wind became a constant presence, a physical force that hammered at the hastily built structures of Providence Gulch. The grand barn, the town's proudest achievement, began to reveal its weaknesses. The wind, just as Abram had predicted, howled around the sharp, 90-degree corners and forced its way through 100 tiny seams in the plank walls. Snow, driven by the gale, began to pile against the long, flat western face, forming a drift that grew higher with each passing day. At first, it was an inconvenience. Soon, it became a menace, blocking the main doors and putting an immense, groaning pressure on the frame. To keep the livestock from freezing, the men had to burn through their firewood at a terrifying rate. The communal woodpile, which had seemed so vast in October, was shrinking with alarming speed. A quiet desperation began to seep into the town. The confident boasts of autumn were replaced by worried murmurs. Elder Sterling offered reassurances, but his words sounded hollow against the shriek of the wind. People started to remember Abram's warning, not with mockery, but with a dawning, chilling unease. Garrett the blacksmith felt it most keenly. His own cabin, built like all the others, was a sieve of cold air. His wife and 2 small children were constantly huddled by the fire, wrapped in every blanket they owned. He spent his days sealing cracks with mud and straw, only to have the wind tear his work away. He remembered Abram's calm, certain voice at the assembly, "The prevailing wind will drive the snow against it." He looked at the monstrous, growing drift that was slowly consuming their barn and felt a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. He had laughed at Abram. He had called his shelter a tomb. Now, his own sturdy home felt more like a trap, and he could not shake the feeling that they, the builders of the great barn, had been the true fools. The town had built a monument to their own haste, and the mountain was beginning to pass its slow, unpitying judgment. While they fought a losing battle against the encroaching cold, Abram and Leo lived in a state of quiet equilibrium, their lives governed by the gentle rhythm of the hearth fire, their world contained within the silent, protective embrace of the ice. Then the sky turned the color of slate, a flat, featureless gray that seemed to press down on the very land itself. The wind died away into an unnerving silence, and the temperature began to plummet. The old trappers had a name for it, the White Death. It was not a storm you could fight, only one you could survive. And survival was measured in degrees. It dropped to 20 below, then 30. The air grew so cold it hurt to breathe, the moisture in one's lungs crystallizing with every inhale. Then it fell further, past any known record, to a staggering 40 degrees below zero. In Providence Gulch, a collective panic set in. The very wood of the cabins groaned in protest, the nails shrinking in their holes. Frost coated the inside of the walls. Fires, no matter how high they were stoked, could not combat the penetrating, absolute cold. Martha, a young widow with 3 small children, wept as she pushed her family's last piece of furniture into the fireplace. The heat was desperate and fleeting. Outside, the world had disappeared into a churning vortex of white. Visibility was zero. The sound of the wind was no longer a whistle but a deafening, elemental roar, the sound of the world being torn apart. Inside the ice cave, the storm was an abstraction. The roar was a deep, distant hum, like a sleeping giant breathing somewhere far away. The temperature inside Abram's wooden cabin remained steady, a comfortable warmth radiating from the hearth. The tons of rock and ice that surrounded them acted as a perfect buffer, impervious to the catastrophic drop in temperature outside. Abram added a single log to the fire, the motion calm and deliberate. Leo was asleep, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, his breathing slow and even. This was the moment of contrast, the ultimate test of two philosophies. Outside, a community built on speed and conformity was freezing, their proudest structures failing, their faith in their own judgment shattering against the fury of the storm. Inside, a father and son, cast out for their unconventional wisdom, were safe and warm, protected not by thick walls of wood but by a deep understanding of the world they inhabited. They had chosen not to fight the winter but to shelter within it, and that choice had made all the difference. The proof was not in an argument won, but in the simple, profound reality of a warm, sleeping child in the heart of an impossible storm. The breaking point for Providence Gulch came on the second night of the blizzard. Under the colossal weight of the snowdrift that now reached its eaves, and battered by winds that struck like cannonballs, the west wall of the great communal barn finally gave way. The sound was a horrifying crack of splintering timber, barely audible over the roar of the storm but felt as a shudder through the frozen ground. A huge section of the roof collapsed inward, exposing the terrified livestock to the full, murderous fury of the blizzard. The town's entire winter supply of meat and milk, their living future, was now freezing to death in a maelstrom of snow and splintered wood. Panic turned to terror. The barn, their symbol of security, was a ruin. The storehouse beside it was now being buried by the same relentless drift. The people were trapped in their individual cabins, which were rapidly becoming ice boxes. The cold was no longer just a hardship, it was a predator, actively hunting them in their homes. Elder Sterling, the man who had preached unity and strength, was broken. He could offer no plan, no hope. His certainty had been a house of cards, and the wind had blown it all away. The community that had prided itself on its collective power was now just a scattered collection of desperate, freezing families, each fighting a solitary, losing battle for survival. The structure they had built to save them had instead become the instrument of their potential doom, its flawed design a fatal error in judgment. The mockery they had heaped upon Abram now tasted like ash in their mouths. His quiet, strange words about wind and angles, dismissed as foolishness, were now echoing in their minds as prophecy. They had built for a winter they understood, a winter of their own imagining. But the mountain had sent them a winter of its own, and against that reality, their proud, square barn was nothing but kindling. The realization was stark and absolute, their way had failed. They had been wrong, catastrophically wrong, and the price of their pride was now being paid by their shivering children. Garrett the blacksmith looked at his wife, her face pale and drawn, and at his two children, huddled together and shaking uncontrollably despite being wrapped in every blanket they owned. The fire was dying, the last of their wood almost gone. He could hear the walls of his cabin creaking, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who works with breaking points, that the structure would not last much longer. In that moment of absolute despair, a single, irrational thought took hold: Abram. The madman in his ice tomb. It was a fool's hope, a desperate gamble, but it was the only hope he had left. "We're going out," he said, his voice a hoarse crackle. His wife looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. "We'll die out there," she cried. "We'll die in here," he answered, his voice grim with resolve. "At least out there is a chance." He bundled his family in their outermost layers, tied a rope around their waists so they would not be separated in the white oat, and plunged into the storm. The force of the wind knocked him off his feet. The cold was a physical blow, stealing his breath. He could not see, he could not hear anything but the roar. He navigated by pure instinct, keeping the rising slope of the foothills to his right, praying he was heading in the right direction. He expected to find Abram and Leo frozen solid, a tragic monument to their own folly. It was what they deserved, what he had predicted. When he stumbled, half frozen, into the unnerving calm of the cave's mouth, he thought he was hallucinating. He followed the faint, flickering light deep into the cavern and found them. Not frozen, but warm. Alive. Abram was sitting by the fire, mending a boot, while Leo slept peacefully. They looked up as Garrett and his family collapsed through the doorway of their small wooden shelter. The warmth inside was shocking, a life-giving miracle. Garrett could only stare, his mind struggling to comprehend the scene. The quiet peace, the steady warmth, the absolute safety of this impossible place. He looked at Abram, his face a mask of awe and shame. "Abram," he choked out, his throat raw. "You knew. You knew this would happen." Abram simply nodded, his expression unreadable in the firelight. He rose and helped Garrett's wife and children closer to the hearth, wrapping them in his own spare blankets. There was no "I told you so." There was no recrimination. There was only the quiet, profound act of making room. Word of Garrett's survival was not spoken, but felt. His empty cabin, discovered by a neighbor on a desperate search for firewood, was a message. He had not died in the storm. He had gone somewhere. And there was only one place he could have gone. The desperate hope that had seized the blacksmith now began to spread like a contagion through the freezing, dying town. The first to follow was Martha, the young widow. One of her children had fallen silent, her breathing shallow, her skin a terrifying, waxy pale. With the ferocious strength of a mother facing the ultimate loss, she wrapped her 3 children in their bedding, tied the youngest to her back, and ventured into the white hell. She followed the faint tracks left by Garrett's family, a trail that was already disappearing under the fresh onslaught of snow. She fell a dozen times, her body screaming in protest, but the image of her children, safe and warm, pulled her forward. When she finally staggered into the cave, she was barely conscious, collapsing at Abram's feet. He and Garrett carried her and her children inside, laying them near the fire, gently chafing their frozen limbs. Abram saw the state of the youngest girl and immediately began to warm her slowly, his movements efficient and practiced. He had seen this before. Soon, another family appeared at the cave mouth, then another. It was a desperate, silent exodus. Husbands carried their wives, parents carried their children. They arrived in 2s and 3s, ghosts emerging from the blizzard, their faces covered in ice, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. The small wooden cabin was quickly filled, the warmest space reserved for the children and the weakest. The larger cavern, shielded from the wind, became a vast, cold, but safe refuge for the others. Abram moved among them, a quiet, commanding presence. He directed the able-bodied men to gather what little dry wood they could find in the sheltered parts of the cave entrance, to tend the fire, to help the newcomers. He had built a shelter for 2, but his foresight had created a sanctuary large enough for 100. The community that had cast him out was now huddled under his protection, their lives entirely dependent on the man they had scorned. The air in the cave was thick with the steam of wet wool, the quiet sounds of weeping, and the overwhelming, humbling silence of shame and gratitude. The blizzard raged for 3 more days. For 3 days, the ice cave was the whole world, a self-contained universe of survival. Abram's small shelter became the heart of a makeshift village, the fire at its center a sacred flame. The families of Providence Gulch, nearly 100 souls in all, huddled together in the cavern's vast, still darkness, sharing the last of their food and the warmth of their bodies. The social order of the town had dissolved, replaced by a more fundamental hierarchy, the strong helped the weak, and everyone listened to Abram. He rationed their meager supplies with quiet authority. He organized shifts to keep the fire burning, to check on the most vulnerable, to clear snow from the cave's entrance. He said little, but his calm demeanor was a balm to their shattered nerves. In him, they no longer saw the strange outcast, the madman. They saw a leader whose wisdom ran deeper than any of them could have imagined. Elder Sterling, his authority gone, his pride crushed, sat silently in a corner, watching the man he had banished save the people he was supposed to lead. The transformation was profound. The townsfolk, who had prized their individuality and their quick, decisive actions, now learned the hard lessons of patience and true community. They were stripped of their possessions and their pride, left with only their shared humanity and their collective debt to the man they had wronged. When the wind finally died and a weak, watery sun appeared in the sky, the silence was as shocking as the storm's fury had been. The survivors emerged from the cave into a world remade, a landscape of immense, sculptural snowdrifts that had buried their town. Providence Gulch was a ruin. The great barn was a skeleton of broken timbers. Half the cabins were crushed or buried completely. It was a scene of utter devastation. But the people were alive. All of them. They stood together, blinking in the bright, cold light, 100 souls saved from the White Death. Sterling approached Abram, his face aged by a decade in a few short days. "We were wrong, Abram," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We would all be dead if not for you. How can we ever repay you?" Abram looked not at Sterling, but at his son Leo, who stood beside him, safe and well. "You rebuild," Abram said simply. "But this time, you build with respect for the mountain." In the spring, when the great thaw came, the people of Providence Gulch did not abandon their ruined valley. They stayed. But they did not rebuild as they had before. The memory of the great blizzard was seared into their collective soul, a harsh but necessary lesson. Under Abram's guidance, they began to construct new homes, not in straight, defiant rows, but nestled into the protective curves of the land. They learned to angle their roofs against the prevailing winds, to build with thicker, more carefully joined walls, and to place their communal buildings in the natural lee of the hills. The 90-degree corner, once the symbol of their hasty efficiency, became a reminder of their folly. Their new architecture was one of humility, of acknowledging a power greater than their own. Abram never held their past judgment against them. He sought no apology beyond the one Sterling had already given. His vindication was not in their words, but in their actions. He taught them what he knew of the land, of the seasons, of listening to the subtle language of the wind and the snow. He was no longer an outsider, he was their anchor, the quiet center of their renewed community. The ice cave became a place of legend, a sacred site. In later years, children would be taken to its mouth and told the story of the great blizzard, of the proud town that almost perished, and of the quiet man who saved them all by building a house inside the heart of winter. His legacy was not written in a book or carved on a monument. It was lived. It was present in the smarter, safer design of every home, in the shared resilience of the community, and in the deep, abiding respect they now held for the wild, unforgiving land they called home. Abram had not set out to save anyone but his son. But in saving his son, he had saved them all, and in doing so, had transformed a town built on pride into a community founded on wisdom. The quiet man had taught them that true strength was not in how fast you could build, but in how well you could listen.